Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Gittin Daf Mem Gimel, and we're starting 6 lines from the bottom on Mem Beis and Beis. We've been discussing Avadim, and we're going to continue that conversation tonight. The Gemara says Mem Beis and Beis, 6 lines from the bottom. A question was raised in the Beis Medrash. Eved shemecharo rabo leknas. Let's say that I own an Eved, and I sell the Eved. I really don't sell the Eved. I just sell the rights of knas to the Eved. We learned yesterday that there's a pasuk in Chumash that says that there's shloshim shkalim kesef that are given over if my Eved gets gored by your shor hamuad. So if your shor hamuad kills my Eved, I get shloshim shkalim. So let's say I'm not selling my Eved. I'm just saying that if there is a scenario in the future when my Eved would get gored, then you're the beneficiary. So let's say you pay me 5 shekel for that, and you're running a risk if my Eved never gets gored. You never get the 30 shekel. But if he does, you get the 30 shekel. So I still own the Eved, but you own the rights to the shkalim. So says the Gemara, how does that work? Do we say machor or eno machor? Does this transaction function, yes or no? The Gemara says, Tiboy le Rab Meir, v'tiboy le Rabbanon. This would be a question, both in according to Rab Meir and according to the Rabbanon. And Mem Beis and Beis, 4 lines from the bottom, Tiboy le Rab Meir, it would be a question to Rab Meir in the following way. Ad kan lo ka'amar Rab Meir, adam makna davar shelo bala olam. In general, Rab Meir has a rule that you cannot make a kinyan for something that hasn't happened yet. But perhaps he only said that, ela kegon peiros dekel de avidi de asu. By peiros dekel, that's something that's very common. Aval hacha, but in this case, when we're saying that I've sold the rights to my Eved as it relates to the possibility of getting a knas later, that's like completely out of bounds. That's like a very unreasonable thing to expect. And even if you want to assume, which is already a crazy assumption, that he's going to actually be gored by your shor hamuad, it's not so simple, it's not so definite, I should say, that he would be mishalim. Why not? Top of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, because perhaps Dilma Modeh Umiftar. We know that when a person is Modeh under certain circumstances, he's pater from payment. Take a look at Rashi, who gives us a little bit more context here, and we'll learn about this more in upcoming Masechtas. Top Rashi, Dibur Hamaschel Dilma Modeh bebezdin, Kodem Ha'adas Edim. Let's say that before Edim come along, you as the owner of your shor hamuad, your modeh, then in such a case, modeh v'knas pater. So if you're being modeh, and the punishment that you're supposed to pay is a knas, and in this case, when your shor hamuad kills my eved, that is called a knas. That's how the Torah refers to the 30 shkalim. So then, modeh v'knas pater. So either way we look at it, it's a very unlikely scenario. So according to Rav Meir, we're not sure how he would look at our case of Eved Shemacharo Rabo Knas, in the event that an Eved is sold only for the rights for his Knas, would that kinyan work? We're not sure according to Rav Meir. And as well, top of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph v'tiboy le Rabbanon. It would also be a question according to the Rabbanon. How so? Says the Gemara as follows. Perhaps ad kan lo ka'amri Rabbanon, that ein adam makna davar shelo bala olam ela kegon peiros dekel. Maybe it's the case that when the Rabbanon say that you're not allowed to make a kinyan on something that hasn't happened yet, that's kigon peros dekel de hashta miha lesnu, because right now, at this very moment, there are no peros on the dekel. However, aval hacha, in our case of you being the owner of the shor hamuad and me being the owner of the eved, at least all of the chess pieces are on the board. Aval hacha haikoi shor, the high koi evet, at least everything is there. So again, we're torn even within the camp of Rav Meir. Would we say that if I tried to sell you the rights to my evet, not the evet, but the rights to knas of my evet, would that kinyan work? Yes or no? We don't know the answer. And the Gemara says 5 lines down on Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Let's try and figure it out. Amar Rabbi Abba Tashma. We have a pasuk that says v'yalid bias, that if there's an Eved who's a Yalid bias, meaning if I own a Shifcha, and the Shifcha has a child, that child is an Eved that is Yalid bias. He's part of my home by birth through the Shifcha. So says the Gemara, Ma Talmud Lomar, what does that part of the pasuk tell us? After all, Im Kinyan Kesef Ochel, if we know that a Kinyan Kesef, if I purchase an Eved and he's allowed to eat Truma, then Yalid bias lo kol shekin. then for sure, if I buy the mother and she's allowed to eat truma, then when the mother who's a shifcha has a child, of course that child's allowed to eat truma. So why do we have that part of the pasuk of Yalid Kesef, of Yalid Bayis? That's obvious. So says the Gemara, Ilu Kain, if it were to be the case that the pasuk only spoke about kinyan kaspo, about me purchasing an eved, and that's what I would have thought would have been the case, where there is access to truma, so then Hayisi Omer, I would have argued the following. Ma kinyan kesef sheyesh bo shava kesef ochel, that when we talk about someone who I purchased an eved for $100, so he has value, so he can eat. Af yalid bayis sheyesh bo shvei kesef ochel. Then perhaps we would also then say that a yalid bayis, that a child who's a yalid bayis, that he was born to a shivcha that I own, that he also has to have a shvei kesef. And as the Rishonim point out over here, not every child has value. Because you can have, as we'll soon see, an eved who's a mukashchin, and he's a yalid bayis. So perhaps we would have said that by kinyan kasbo, because I paid for you as an eved, you can eat truma. But by the yalid bayis, he's born to my shifcha who I didn't pay for. So perhaps if he's a mukashchin and he's useless and nobody would ever spend money on him, he has no dollar value. So then perhaps it's the case that he would not benefit from the food. And says the Gemara in the Brisa, how do we know that even if the yalid bayis has no financial value because he's a mukashchin or he's injured, how do we know that he still eats from the truma? Talmud lomar yalid bayis mikol makom. Nevertheless, under all circumstances, says the Gemara, both a yalid bayis, a child born to my shifcha, or the shifcha that I purchased, they all have access to truma. We're not yet done with the Brisa. We're not yet at our question. We'll get there shortly. And we're about 10 lines down on Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, and the Brisa continues. Ve'adayin ani omer, I still have more to say about this pasuk. The pasuk speaks about yalid bayis. This is the child that's born to the shivcha that I've purchased. Bein sheyesh bo shvei kesef, bein she'ein bo shvei kesef ochel. Whether or not the yalid bayis has financial value, he should be able to eat. Kinyan kesef, I might have said only yesh bo shvei kesef ochel, but ein bo shvei kesef ein ochel. I might have thought, and this is learning the pasuk from the other direction, I might have thought that when it comes to an eved that I've purchased, to a shivcha that I purchased, or an eved that I purchased, only if there is financial value in that person can they eat truma. Says the Gemara, that's not correct. Talmud lomar kinyan kaspo v'yulid beso. The pasuk has both languages. The two types of eveds that the pasuk speaks about is an eved that is purchased and an eved that is born to one that is purchased. Ma yalid bayis afal pi she'eno shaveh klum ochel. Just like a child who's born to the shivcha, who I, as the Baal, own, he's allowed to eat from truma, even if he has no value, even if he's a mukashchin, he's got boils all over him, he has no value in the market at all. And therefore, because that's true, af kinyan kaspa afal pi she'eno shaveh klum ochel. So that's the end of the brayso. So basically, at length, we were describing why we needed both phrases in the pasuk. One referencing avadim that I purchased outright, the shivcha, and the second referencing avadim that were born to the shivcha that I purchased. And we're pointing out that we need both to ensure that we know that that both of these categories of avadim are able to eat even if there's no financial value to them. So now, let's go back to our question. We had said, am I allowed to sell my eved to you for only the rights of the knas of that eved? Says the Gemara, a third of the way down on Mem Gimel, Amud Aleph, v'isal kadaitach eved shemecharo rabo leknas machur. If you want to say that transaction is valid, that if I try to sell the rights of knas to my eved, you want to buy that. It's worth 30 shekel if he ever gets gored. You pay down 5 shekel, let's say, so it's much to your benefit if he ends up getting gored. So says the Gemara, if that were to be true that kinyan was correct, mi'ika avda, delo mizdavin leknasa. There's no such thing as an eved that doesn't have value, because even the worst eved in the world has a value on the market. So therefore, it must be the case that it is not a real kinyan. It must be the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a good understanding of even the question. And the Gemara says, we do have a scenario where there's no value at all. Because the Gemara says, Ika eved trefa. Let's say you have an eved that's about to die. No one's going to buy that eved. If you have a clunker that it says on the odometer, about to die, no one's going to buy the car. The wheels are falling off. No one's buying. If the eved is at the end of his life, he has a terminal disease, he's going to die within 12 months, it's not for sale. No one's going to want to buy him. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. At least the Eved could stand in front of you before he dies. Maybe he does have some remaining value before he dies. Says the Gemara, not only is he a treifa, but he's bimenuval umukashchin. He's disgusting and he's covered in boils. This is not good property to own. You have an Eved who is a treifa, which means halachically speaking, we assume he's going to die. He is a menuval, he's disgusting, and he's covered in boils. He's not the kind of guy you want washing your dishes or cleaning your floors. You don't even want him in sight. He is a zero value property. So that's what the Gemara says. We don't really have a good answer to our question. We don't know if the kinyan is valid. If I try to sell the rights of knas for my Eved, we don't know. Let's move on to the next question. We're about 5-6 lines before the wide lines on Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. Ibayalahu. Misha chetzio Eved v'chetzio ben choren. I have an Eved. He's half Eved, half ben choren. Shekidesh bas choren. So this guy who, John, my Eved, he's 50-50. He's half Ben Chorin, half Eved. And he breaks the rules. And he goes over to a nice Yiddish girl and he says, Harat mekudeshes li b'tabazu kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, I'd like to marry you. And he hands her a ring and she accepts it in front of Adim. Worst possible scenario or best possible scenario. So this guy broke the rules because he's half Eved, because he's really not allowed to marry anyone. Does the transaction work? If this guy breaks the rules, he's Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, and he proposes to a regular Jewish girl, good or not good? Does the transaction work? Says the Gemara, Mahu, what's the din? Im Tim Salomar, if you want to say the case is a Ben Yisrael, Sha'amar Lebas Yisrael, let's say that a regular Yiddish guy goes over to a regular Yiddish girl and says, he's Kachi Lechatzoi, I want you to only marry half of me. I don't even know what that means, but that's what he says in the shtar. That's what he says when he says marry. Hare'at nikudeshes li lechatzoi kedas Moshe v'Yisrael. So the halacha is in the brayso mikudeshes. Why? Because the chazia lekule. When we look at it structurally, even if I say to her, I only want you to marry half of me, but she's in theory able to marry all of me, even if there was a way to parse me out. But in regards to the case of Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Choren, halo chazia lekule. She's not allowed to marry the whole Eved because half of him is an Eved and half of him is a Ben Chorin. And v'im tim salomar ben Yisrael makadesh chatzi isha. Let's say the reverse, that a man who is a regular Yisrael wants to get engaged to a chatzi isha, and he says hare'at mikudesh asikedash Moshe v'Yisrael, but only half of you, the woman. So says the Gemara, that's Eina Mikudeshes, the shiur bekinyano, because he left over some of his kinyan. V'ha Eved, but in regards to an Eved, maybe we would have said, lo shiur bekinyano, because he's only 50% married. He couldn't exceed 50%. So how do we view all of these iterations of half marriages, and primarily focusing on our question, that if an Eved who's Chatzi Eved and Chatzi Ben Chorin, if he proposes to a Yiddish maidel, Harat Mikudeshes Likdas Moshe v'Yisrael, would they be married? The Gemara says, my first long line, Toshma. The Gemara says, let's see. We have a brisa that we've learned twice already. This is the third time. Hemis. Let's say that an animal gores an Eved, Mishachatzio Eved, V'chatzio Ben Chorin, and the Eved that he killed was a 50-50 Eved. He half belongs to me and he's half free. So what did we say? This cryptic answer that we saw on the bottom of Mem Beis Amud Aleph and wrapping to the top of Mem Beis Amud Beis, what did we see? No saying chatzi knas the rabbo, that half of the 30 shekel knas goes to the master, and v'chatzi kofer liyorshav, and half of the value of the Eved, not knas, but just dollar amount, let's say that he's worth $100, so then $50 goes to the yorshim of the Eved. So says the Gemara, what type of Eved were we talking about in this case? Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin. And then we said, he has Yorshim. How does he have Yorshim? How does a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Choren, have Yorshim? If he marries a Shivcha, the children are Avadim. If he marries a Yiddish Meidel, then the kinyan shouldn't work. So therefore, the Gemara says, V'i amris kidushav lav kiddushin. If you want to say that the marriage that was proposed by the Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Choren to a regular woman doesn't work, Yorshin minale, then how in the world could this brisa speak about the yorshim of a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin? It must therefore be, says the Gemara, based on an inference from the brisa, that if a man who's Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin goes over to a woman and says, Harat Mekudesh Zikdash Moshe v'Yisrael, the Kedushin is Chal, and their children are not Avadim. How do we know? Because we saw this case that when this guy, Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chorin, was gored, $50, half of his dollar value goes to his yorshim. The only way there could be Yorshim is if the Kedushin was Chal. So says the Gemara, no, I disagree. Amar of Ada bar Ava, third of the wide lines, 2/3 of the way down, kshaso treifa. Maybe when the animal gored the Eved, he didn't kill the Eved, he maimed him to the point that he is basically going to die. He's in a coma. He has less than 12 months to live. In halacha by Hilchot Shchita, we translate a treifa as having less than 12 months to live. And that animal is a treifa, and therefore they're not even edible, right? Even though the animal is 99.9% kosher, but they have something wrong in their body that halacha determines them as a treifa, that animal is an isser d'oraisa to eat, even if you shecht it perfectly. It's walking fine, it's eating fine, it's sleeping fine, it's functioning fine, but it has one little error in one piece of fascia in the body, the animal is a treifa d'oraisa. It's going to die within 12 months. So we know, says the Gemara, that there was damages, but perhaps, says Rav Ada bar Ava, that maybe the animal didn't gore this guy, he only maimed him, says the Gemara. And how then will we explain Yorshem? It doesn't mean real Yorshem. Umay Yorshav, it just means that it goes to Nafshe, it goes to himself. So this is a bit of a fudge dancer. You're squeezing a square peg into a round hole. And Rava, and this is Rava's personality throughout Shas, and Rava and Abaye have this argument hundreds of times throughout Shas. Abaye says something, Rava says that's not what it says in the Brisa. Rava is a textual type of learner. He doesn't want to twist and make the words into a pretzel to make it work. So what does he say? Amar Rava, shtei tshuvos bedavar. I have two things to respond to your, and please excuse me, your ridiculous suggestion. First of all, chada, the yorshav ktani. It says those who will inherit him. You're reinterpreting the word into a pretzel to say that it means him. It doesn't mean him. It means his yorshim. And furthermore, koferhu. It says he's paying money that's not knas. Kofer is a payment of something for someone who isn't an Eved. And therefore, when is Kofer paid? Only with death, and not with maiming, not with making him a treifa. So Rava just blows out of the water the shita of Rav Ada bar Ava. Amar Rava, really, what are we talking about over here? Says the Gemara, de rawi litol ve'enlo. Really, says the Gemara, it's appropriate for him to take. He just doesn't have children. It says Rashi de rawi litol. We're 2/3 of the way down. Rashi says Dibur hamaskal rawi litol de palga lav bar knasahu ela bar kofer. Half of this eved is not knas oriented because half of him is free. So the half of the eved that's an eved that is knas. The half of the eved that is a ben choren, that is kofer. What does it mean? Ve'ein lo. Rashi says ve'ein lo sharei mes. The Yorshim ein lo sheyigvu. So there could have been, in theory, there could have been Yorshim. So that's what the Gemara says is Rava's response. And the Gemara says as follows, moving on to another part of the sugya, Amar Rava, 2/3, a little bit more than 2/3 of the way down, 6 lines into the wide lines, or this could also be Rabba, not exactly sure who it is. Kishem shehamekadesh chatzi isha eina mekudeshes. Rava says that just like if a person tries to be mekadesh, half of a woman, it doesn't work. Kach chetzia shivcha v'chetzia bas choren sheniskacha ein kiddusheha kiddushin. So too, if a Yisrael tries to marry a woman who's half shivcha, half ben choren, half bas choren, the marriage is a 0. And Darash Rabba bar Rav Huna very similarly, Kishem shamekadesh chatzi isha eina mekudeshes, just like half of a woman can't be married, so too kach chetzia shivcha v'chetzia bas choren also sheniskacha eina mekudeshes. But Rav Chizda doesn't like the comparison. We said just like a man marrying half a woman is a 0, so too a man marrying a shivcha chatzi bas choren is also a 0. Rav Chizda doesn't hear of this one at all. Amar le Rav Chizda midami. Are these cases even comparable at all? Hasam shiur bekinyano. Hacha lo shiur bekinyano. In the first case, when a man was trying to marry a woman and only marry half of her, but at least there's more of her that in theory he could marry. But in the second case, where the husband was trying to marry a chatzi bas choren, chatzi shivcha, there, says the Gemara, hacha lo shiur bekinyano. Perhaps that marriage should in fact be good. So says the Gemara, Rav Chizda pushed back very hard, and Hadar Okim Rabba bar Rav Huna Amora Ale. Rabba bar Rav Huna, who was an Amora, he got this. In this case, the word Amora means a speaker. It means someone who's going to remember the way shiurim were given. The Amora would speak. The Rav would speak quietly. Let's say Rabba in this case, he would speak quietly, and then in turn, someone would be his mouthpiece and say the shiur out loud. So he actually called out his own error. He listened to Rav Chizda. And Rabbah said, you're 100% right. I made a mistake. And he says, V'darash, he says the pasuk, this refers to a time around the first Beis Hamikdash where there weren't a lot of Talmidei Chachamim to paskin shailas. And this mishakela, this burden of yours is tachas yadecha. You who do know Torah, you have no choice but to take on the mantle of being the posek of the community. We need your help. And ein adam omed al divrei Torah elim kein nichshal bahen. The only way that a person grows through Torah is by stumbling and making mistakes. Chazdei Hashem, because we all make a lot of mistakes when we learn. So the Gemara says over here, what was Rabbah saying back to Rav Chizda? You're right, I goofed up, I said it incorrectly. And here's really how it should be. Afal pi, it shouldn't be kishem, that X and therefore Y. Afal pi, even though in one case X, but the halacha is different elsewhere. Afal pi she'amru hamikadesh chatzi isha ina mikudeshes. Even though if a man were to try and marry a woman and only marry chatzi isha, only half of her. However, aval chetzia shivcha v'chetzia baschorn sheniskacha kidusheha kidushin. It actually is the case that if a man walks over to a shivcha, a regular yid walks over to a chatzi shivcha chatzi baschorn and says hareat mikudeshes likdas Moshe v'Yisrael, they are halachically married, and their children will not be avadim; their children will be regular Yisraelim. My taima. Why is it that Rabbah agreed to Rav Chizda's pushback? Says the Gemara, because of the svara that was given earlier. Hasam shiur b'kinyano. Over there, when a man tried to marry a woman who was only chatzi isha, he only wanted to marry 50% of her. There he left over space for more kinyan because there's another 50% of the woman. But hacha, in regards to the man marrying the chatzi shivcha, chatzi baschorn, in such a case, hacha lo shiur b'kinyano. He didn't leave anything over. He was only able to marry 50%. And the Gemara says that according to Rav Chizda, and now Rabbah joining his side, it seems to be that the din is that a person is successfully going to be married if a regular man says to a chatzi shivcha, chatzi baschorn, that harad mikudeshesli, then they're married. Amar Rav Sheshes, he disagrees. Kishem shemekadesh chatzi isha ena mikudeshes kachetzia shivcha v'chetzia baschorn sheniskacha ein kidushei kiddushin. He argues and says no, both cases are aser. I disagree with Rav Chizda and Rabbah on the one side. So now we have a machlokes. Rav Chizda and Rabbah say that if a man proposes to a woman who's chatzi shivcha chatzi baschorn, Rav Chizda and Rabbah say that she's mekudeshes. Rav Sheshes says they're not mekudeshes. If someone's going to say that maybe they should be married because ezoi shivcha charufa, what is the definition of a shivcha charufa? Perhaps the case is zuchatzia shivcha v'chatzia baschorin hameurasa le'avarivri alma bas isrusehi. If we're defining in this brisa about shivcha charufa that a shivcha charufa is this woman in discussion, a woman who's a chatzi shivcha and chatzi baschorin, and there is erusin, and maybe this is a kasha on Rav Sheshes because Rav Sheshes says they're not married. And here we see that they are married. Says the Gemara, Emor lach kilach etzel Rabbi Shmuel. I'll send them to go look at the Shita Rabbi Shmuel, who understands the Bryce of Ezu hi shivcha charufa differently. What does he say? Shehu omer b'shivcha kenainis hameurasa le'avarivri. We're not talking about a regular case of shivcha charufa where you think we're talking about chatzi shivcha chatzi baschor. That case is not talking about that, and therefore the Shita of Rav Sheshes can stand. Rather, that case is talking about a shivcha kenan is hameurasa le'avarivri. Asks the Gemara, shivcha kenan is basis rusehi. A shivcha kananis. If I walk over to a shivcha kananis and I say harad mikudeshesli, and I hand it to her in front of the biggest tzaddikim edim in the world, I still wouldn't be married to her. So what does that brisa mean? When we define, according to Rabbi Shmuel, the case of Esavi Shivcha Charufa as a Shivcha Kananis HaMeurasa, how can it be that she is ever engaged? It must be my Meureses Miyuchedes. It doesn't mean that they're married, but that he's waiting for her. He's set her aside. So perhaps Hachanami, my Meureses Miyuchedes. Perhaps in this case, it could just be that they're engaged and not married. And therefore, again, Rav Sheshes can hold his case. Let's review this because it's very detailed, and I'll just synthesize this down into basically one sentence and the machlokas. We're not sure if a man, when he proposes to a woman who's a chatzi shivcha, chatzi baschorin, if the mechanics of that kiddushin work. Rabbah and Rav Chizda were of the opinion that the mechanics do not work. And Rav Sheshes said the mechanics do work. And we just don't know how we paskin from the Gemara, and that is how the Gemara ends this particular part of the sugya.
Sorry, the status of the man in that case?
The man is a Yisrael,
okay,
and he's proposing to a woman who's a chatzi shivcha chatzi baschorin. So he does everything right as it relates to regular kiddushin rules. Harad mikudeshesli, he hands her something that's a shava pruta, fine. Says the Gemara, only some of the Amoraim say it works, and some say that it doesn't. And we, from our Gemara, we can't tell the answer, and it remains a machlokes as to whether this is the case. And these aren't common cases today because we don't have, as far as I know, we don't have anyone who really has a shivcha. I don't know how that works. Is that a thing? I don't know. Okay, next case. We are 2 lines from the bottom on Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Chiza, Chatzia Shivcha v'Chatzia Bas Choren. That was the woman that we're talking about. Sheniskad Shel Ruvain. She got engaged. So now we're under the assumption it works, right? It's also odd because look who said it. Rav Chiza. Okay, that's a Rishonim question. Says the Gemara that according to Rav Chiza, if this woman is Chatzia Shivcha v'Chatzia Bas Choren, she got engaged to Ruvain, and then the Nishtachrara. So now she's no longer Chatzi Eved Chatzi Bas Choren. So here's the flow of events. Ruvain goes over to this woman. Let's call her Rose. Goes over to Rose. She's a Chatzi Shivcha Chatzi Bas Choren. Harat Mekudesha Sekdas Moshe Yisrael. She accepts the Kiddushin. Now we know Rav Chiza doesn't agree to this marriage. But Rav Chiza then says, what if the owner then frees her? What happens to that Kiddushin? Okay. Now let's get a little Yavamosi. Ready? We're going to add a little bit of a twist. V'chazra v'niskad l'shimin. And then after the shichror, this woman, who's now a full-fledged Jew, no longer a half-Jew, she then gets engaged to Shimon. Rashi points out, Shimon echav uvechaye Ruvain v'Ruvain lo girsha. So let's go the flow of events again. Let's get the case clear. Okay. This feels like Yavamos because it is Yavamos. The Gemara says
it does seem clear that the first marriage is nothing.
We gotta wait. The case is not clear yet. Okay. So case number 1, a woman is a Chatzi Eved Rose. She's Chatzi Eved Chatzi Bas Choren. Reuven goes over and proposes halachically while she is in this state. She accepts Kiddushin. And then the next day, the owner of Rose is Meshachrer her entirely. Now she's a regular Jewish girl. Shimon, Reuven's brother, proposes halachically to Rose. Okay, says the Gemara, and then umesu shnehem. Then both Reuven and Shimon, who were both alive for all of the previous events, died. Is there a halachic status of Yibum for Levi, the third brother? Says the Gemara, misya bemes leLevi. That's incredible. Okay, we have to figure out what's going on here. We could already postulate a simple answer, which is that for sure the second Kiddushin should have made her married to Shimon enough that we should now have Yibum when he dies.
Unless she was married to Reuven.
Unless she was married to Reuven. Very good. So then the Gemara says, turning to the top of Mem Gimel Amud Beis, and this really is a parenthetical comment that only belongs in Yevamos, and that is Ve'ein ani kore ba'eshes shnei mesim. This is a separate din. I am the very lengthy Rashi here at the top. We're not concerned about the fact that Reuven and Shimon both died in this case. And says the Gemara, why is it that we allow Yibum to take place here? And the Gemara explains as follows: Manafshach. One way or the other, it makes sense. I kiddushay de Reuven kiddushin, kiddushay de Shimon lav kiddushin. If the kiddushin of Reuven was authentic and it halachically worked, even though it shouldn't have happened because she was a shivcha, a half shivcha at the time. So if that first kiddushin worked with Reuven, then when she tried to get engaged to Shimon, even though they went through all the steps, but they're not married because a woman cannot be engaged to two men. The kiddushin, the Shimon kiddushin, and if the second kiddushin of Shimon was in fact a kiddushin, then by definition, kiddushin de Reuven lav kiddushin. So mimanavshach, no matter how we cut this case, she is allowed to do yibum to Levi. What? Or whatever. Levi is he's a yavam. I have a kasha on this, and I believe that this is the crux of this sugya. Why haven't we analyzed the effects of shichror on the kiddushin of Reuven? Kiddushin, shichror, kiddushin, misa.
How does that help the kiddushin?
She's not the same woman anymore.
Right, but kiddushin was 5 hours ago or yesterday. So I don't. Why would that change?
I don't understand the miman of shach. I would have assumed the Gemara would have said that shichror negatively impacts the kiddushin of Reuven. That's one side of the miman of shach.
Not kasi basar, and she's married to Reuven, and Shimon is makadesh.
0.
And it's 0. And Reuven dies.
Then
that
she
night,
she
you
goes
don't
to
say
Levi.
that we go back to the Kedushin.
Uh-huh.
Why would this be anymore?
You're right.
I think.
Yeah, I think you're explaining
It's
them.
not just complicated because it's katsi.
Right. I think the part that I was hoping the Gemara would articulate more is the shift between her going from a Chatzi Shivcha to a Bas Yisrael.
Not
Well, the only-
who they married her and maybe couldn't have in the first place.
Well, right. I mean, Rav Chiza doesn't like that anyways. I mean that.
If not for the shift, we probably the arguments one or you. That's probably the only thing that changed by the shift. Otherwise,
My brain hurts listening to you for very good reason. Say that again, please.
if not for the shift, we probably would not require Yibum from later.
Correct.
That's the only thing that would change.
But when the Gemara says that it's possible that Shimon's Kedushin was real and Ruvain's wasn't, it's because what? Because of post Shichrur. So that's part of the Lumdus, is that the Shichrur changes this woman to she's a different Rose now. Now she's Razel. Now she's a different woman now. And because of that, and the Gemara doesn't paint a clear picture as to which one of these is more authentic than the other. But that's why the Miman of Shach works, and Levi becomes a Yavam. And she becomes a Shomeres Yavam. Okay, similarly, but we'll see not so similar in a moment. It sounds similar. Itmar, Chatzia Shivcha v'Chatzia Bas Chorin. These words we're familiar with already, because 5 minutes ago it hurt us to even think about that. Now we have this case. Sheniskacha leRuvein v'nishtachrara, v'Chazer v'niskacha leShimon. Sound familiar? Says Rashi, this Shimon is not a brother.
No.
So you take a look at Rashi right next to us. This isn't a brother. So this case is a little bit different, because says the Gemara, Rav Yosef Bar Chama Amar Rav Nachman Paku Kiddushay Rishon. The first kiddushin is gone because of the shichrur. Reb Zera Amar Rav Nachman Gamru Kiddushay Rishon. That when she's nishtachrira, that's what completes the marriage. So this is really this is the next level of lumdus that we were trying to figure out, is how do we look at that shift? And the Gemara here has a machlokes amoraim about the shift. Do we say that when there's shichror, the shichror severs the tie of the first kedushin? Or do we say that when there's a shichror, it makes her into a more complete bride, and therefore the wedding is even more chal? And Reb Zera says, Amar Reb Zera kavasei didi mistabra. Of course he's going to say that I think I'm right. Why does he say that? Dichsiv, because the pasuk says, Lo yumsu ki lo chufsha. There will be no death because she's not freed. Ha chufsha, had she been freed, namely if she was a shifcha and she became freed, and then they were intimate, yumsu. What does that imply? That she's dying, that she's engaged. She's a aramurasa. She's an arusa. Okay. Amar le Abaye. Ulatana de Rabbi Shmuel da Amar b'shivcha kanainis hameureses la'ever ivri hachanami dechichuf shayomsu. This is really a bit of a side point, but the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Shmuel, this was the Rabbi Shmuel that we saw on the previous Amud, who, when we were discussing the case of the shivcha charufa, he defined the shivcha charufa as a shivcha kanainis who was engaged, and there we said that the chuf shayomsu, that when she gets freed, that they'll be killed. That's not true. That's not true, because their kiddushin is only miyuchedet. She's only set aside. They're not halachically married, because if I go over to a full shivcha and propose to her, it doesn't count at all. Ela mai islach l'meimar. It must be shechufsha v'chazra v'niskacha. Hachanami shechufsha v'chazra v'niskacha. So says the Gemara, I disagree with Reb Zera. Reb Zera wanted to say that the shichrur completes the marriage. She was a partial isha. She's half shivcha, half bas chorin. When there's shichror, she becomes a full case. Says Rabbi Shmuel, lav dafka. It could be the case that they redid their vows after the shichror. It could be that Ruvain proposed to the chatzi shivcha, chatzi bas chorin. Then there's shichror. And then he's nervous and he's like, let's just do this again one more time. Aret mekudesh l'zikdas Moshe Yisrael. You're a full bas Yisrael. Then they're married. So says the Gemara, there's not a riot to Reb Zera Shita. And again, back to square one, we really don't know the lumdus. Does shichror enhance or does shichror hurt that first proposal? Third of the way down, heading to the next Mishnah. Amar Rav Huna bar Katina, Amar Rav Yitzchak, Ma'isa b'isha achas, there was a case, shechatzia shivcha v'chetzia bas chorin, of a woman who was half slave, half free, v'kafu es rabba ve'asa bas chorin, and the master, who still owned a part of her as a shivcha, was forced to free her. Says the Gemara, Kiman, and this is a huge discussion in regards to having children. Says the Gemara, Kirav Yochanan ben Beroka, to Amar, who says that the mitzvah of pru urvu is al shnehem hu omer vayavarech osam elokim vayomer b'chulei pru urvu umilu. According to this approach, a woman has a mitzvah of pru urvu also, not just men. We don't typically look at it that way. And the next shita supports our more common approach. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lo. The reason why we force the Baal, who still owns the half of this woman who's a shivcha, to free her, is not because of pru urvu. Rather, minag hefker noaguba. That when this woman is stuck in the twilight zone of not being able to marry anyone, the temptation is too great because she has no one who she can be intimate with, and she's likely to lead to promiscuity. She's not so frum. She has a very low level of halachic obligation.
Jewish.
What? She's Jewish. Like it's a funny place to be. It is. It's awkward, and they're afraid of her misbehaviors. So this is a chakira and lamdas about why we force the owner to free the half shivcha. Is it because the mitzvah of pru urvu applies to both of them, and therefore we should free her up so she can fulfill that mitzvah, or no? And this is the more common approach as it relates to pru urvu. The pru urvu is only a din by the husband. This is a machlokes rishonim. Is getting married a mitzvah, or is it only a hechi timsa to the mitzvah of pru urvu? That's its own discussion. And says the Gemara, minag hefker no aguba. End of this sugya. Changing gears a little bit, we'll be going to the top of Mem Daled Amud Aleph at the 2 dots, and then as you can see on Shabbos, we have a lot of ground to cover. Oh. You're right. That means tomorrow night we have a lot of ground to cover. Thank you for ruining my day tomorrow. Thank you. Well, I guess you're just pre-gaming because it was either now or tomorrow morning when I sat down to figure it out. But we'll have to figure it out because there's a lot of lines in here. I hope it's Agadata. Anyways, says the new Mishnah. Hamocher avdo le'ovdei kochavim. If I sell my eved, Jack, and I sell him to a guy, l'chutz la'aretz, even if I sell him to a Jew, but that Jew is moving to chutz la'aretz, shegetz, yatsa ben chorin. The halacha is that this eved goes free. The Mishnah opens with a brisa, Tanu Rabbanon, Hamocher avdo le'ovdei kochavim, yatsa l'cherus. If I sell John to a goy, so then he goes free. V'tzarich get shichur me rabo rishon, and I, as a yid, have to give over a get shichur. Amar Rashbag, Bamed Dvarim Amurim, that's only true of Shalo Kasav Alav Ono, where there wasn't another document already in play. We'll discuss this in a moment. Aval Kasav Alav Ono, if there already was a document that referred to the Eved, Zehu Shichruro, then that document has a double function, whatever its initial function was, plus the fact that he no longer needs a separate get shichrur. My Ono, what type of document are we talking about that can be written in place of a get shichrur? 3/4 of the way from the bottom, 12 lines or so from the bottom, Amar Rav Sheshes, to Kasav Le Hachi, where it says in the get, L'chashetivrach mimenu ein li esek bach. If for any reason you run away from this guy, from the guy, you and I are done. Now he's not writing it as a get shichrur. He wrote it as a line in another get, in another document, but it still has a double function. We don't need a separate get shichrur, which is very unique. By a woman, we would need that. By an eved, we don't. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan. The Brisa teaches us as follows. Love alav min ha'oved kochavim. Let's say that I have a deal with an oved kochavim, and I say, if I don't pay you back on time, my eved is yours. He functions as a collateral, and that's what it means. Loved alav, on him. We are using the eved as a collateral. Kevan she'asalo oved kochavim nimuso yatsa lecherus. Once the oved kochavim does nimuso, we don't know what that means yet. So then says the Gemara, he goes free. My nimuso. What does it mean that an eved does nimuso? Rav Huna Reb Yehuda says nashki. A nashki is like a signet. It's some type of armband, a necklace, a cartilage pierce, something that indicates that this guy belongs to this new goyish eved. The moment that happens, he's yatsa lecherus. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Nashki doesn't always mean that. I should say better. Nimuso doesn't always mean nashki. That's the right way to say it. Because the Gemara says, Masiv Rav Sheshes, if you have ha'arisin v'hacharichos, these are people who work fields, v'arisei bate avos, people who work ancestral fields, and then our case, v'oved kochavim shemashchan sadeu leIsrael, or if you have an oved kochavim who is making a transaction about a field with a Jew, afal pi she'asa lo nimuso p'tura min ha'maiser, even though the goy did his nimus, the halacha is, he's pater from maiser. V'isal kadaitach, that the word nimuso means nashki, a signet. So we don't do that on property. We only do that on people. Sade bas nashki. So the word nashki is wrong, because you thought the word nashki means that he's giving him a necklace that indicates that he's his, a permanent bracelet. Again, whatever the Eved would do to indicate that this Eved actually belonged to him, that doesn't apply to the ground. So therefore, what does the word nashki mean? Says the Gemara, Elo Amar Reb Sheshes Zman. When he puts a date on the document, that if he puts a date on the document, so then even if once he puts the date on the document, then he's going to be pater from the meiser, because then the property belongs to a goy. So says the Gemara, that's a problem of kasha, zman, azman. We have a kasha of one brisa indicating one thing about time, and another brisa indicating another thing about time. Take a look at Rashi. The middle width Rashi is the last line of the middle width Rashi's fifth line from the bottom. Dibra masel kasha zman azman. Digabe eved, in regards to a case of eved, when the zman is listed choshiv le mechira, when the time, the date is indicated on the get, it's considered a sale. Digabe sode lav mechirahi. Why do we make this distinction? Says the Gemara, 4 lines from the bottom. Lo kasha hadamata zmane hodalamata zmane. The Gemara is not having any contradictions. In one case, the time does work in both cases, but in one case, the time had passed, and in one case, the time didn't. It's a new kimta, but still a valid answer. Says the Gemara, why would that need to be the case? If we have a contract that says that you, Mr. Goy, I have a contract with you, that if I don't fulfill my obligations to you by May 1st, you get my Eved, and today is June 20, whatever it is, June 20th, of course the Eved belongs to you. Why would I have to say that case? Therefore, I don't like your distinction. Ella, says the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom, Ella idi v'idi de lo matazmane. Really, both of them are before the date was reached on the get, both in regards to the Eved and in regards to the Sadeh. But in one case, we're talking about the goof of the Eved, and in one case, we're talking about the peiros of the field, and the halachos are drastically different. You're right that time is a similar factor, but what is being transacted is very different. The transactions are not the same about an Eved as they are with the peiros. Or the Gemara says, as a last answer on the top of Mem Daled Amud Aleph, V'i Ba'isema, V'shalava Almanas Lamashkeno, really, the field or whatever, the field or the Eved were being loaned out al Manas Lamashkeno to pawn the Eved, V'lo Mashkeno, and we have yet to give over the Eved. And in these cases, Rashi details the difference between them as to why there's differences between a field and an Eved, but nevertheless, all of this functions as a distinction between the two, and therefore the Gemara says there's no machlokas between Zman and Zman, and the way we use Zman by Eved and by Sadeh is not a contradiction to one another. We're going to stop right here at Tanu Rabbanan. We'll pick up Emir Hashem tomorrow night with Mem Daled and Mem Hey Amud Aleph. Hashem should bless us all. Wishing you all a beautiful night.